absolutely. Yeah. So are we looking at each other or are we looking at the audience?
I think kind of a little bit of both, actually.
Okay.
I mean, I'll start out looking at you, but then feel free to talk to the audience.
Yeah. And we'll try to keep it short.
Yes, exactly.
Short and sweet. I mean,
Then you can have a drink.
Good evening.
No, I don't mean short.
If I could have your attention, please. All right, the evening's about to begin. My name is Dominic Falder. I'm a board member of the FCCT. We hold programs every week. Our flagship programs are on Wednesday nights. If you are not a member of the club, please consider joining because we need all the support we can get. As you can see, this is an exceptionally heavy turnout. There are a few seats. There's one seat here if somebody's looking to sit down, and if anybody else has got some seats to give away, raise your hand. Just coming up, that's already gone. In fact, there's almost nothing coming up. We have board games next Tuesday, and we have a seminar which is closed. So we have trivia night, if you'd like to come and test your wits against other teams, and that's on Friday the 28th at 7 p.m. Everybody's welcome. It's open house. This program tonight has been keenly awaited. It's been in the planning for about a month, so it gave people plenty of notice, and we're very honoured to have in the clubhouse tonight Michael Sheridan, who spent 15 years amazingly based here as the correspondent of the Sunday Times, and that followed 5 years in the same position, basically the Asia editor, the Asia correspondent for the Sunday Times in Hong Kong. He's worked for Reuters, ITN, TV, The Independent, and is the author as well of The Gate to China, which came out in 2021. These books are available here tonight, both The Gate and the book that we're going to discuss, The Red Emperor, Xi Jinping and His New China. The format tonight is not going to be the author just speaking and a moderator intervening. We've got Keith Richburg here, who is an equally distinguished correspondent. He's a former president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong and took it through a tumultuous period when basically Beijing was trying to put it out of business. I think it still is. I think if there's anybody on this earth who can take credit for the Hong Kong Club still being open for another couple of years, it's probably Keith. He's now retired in Bangkok, but he's actually still working very hard. He's a member of the Washington Post editorial board, has been on that since 2023. And he's a veteran observer of Xi Jinping and China, having headed the bureau there for how many years was that?
About 3.5.
3.5 years. And he's also been bureau chief elsewhere in the world. So we have two very storied careers, veteran journalists making the most of the biggest story in Asia. Not the biggest story in the world at the moment, but the biggest story in Asia. So, gentlemen, I hand the floor to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dominique. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. Really exciting to see such a packed house here at the FCCT, which I think is a testament to our author here. And also the book. And I know many of you haven't read the book yet, but you can buy it in the back, correct? And
you can.
You can, and I believe Michael, my buddy Michael here, will be here to sign copies of it. And I personally loved it. I devoured it. If you're a China file, you've been following events in China since the rise of Xi Jinping, you'll find all kinds of deep, rich information in there that you didn't know. If you're not a China file, if you're not well versed in it, Michael, I guess you did a really good job of just giving the backstory and explaining things so the average reader can find it very accessible.
Well, I mean, it is written for the ordinary reader.
Yeah.
It is hopefully credible for the expert, but I set out to write a clear, simple, direct book that anybody could read and understand, because outside Asia in particular, the degree of ignorance about basic facts concerning China is extraordinary.
I found it absolutely fascinating, and I have to admit, I'm a little bit jealous, because when I left China in 2013, I thought, oh, maybe I should write a book about Xi Jinping. My problem was, no records were available and nobody would talk to me. How did you manage to get over that hurdle?
Actually, that was the same problem a decade later. I wrote the book on Hong Kong, and after it came out, the publisher said, well, why don't you do a biography of Xi Jinping? And I said, because it's impossible. I had written a Sunday Times magazine cover story on Xi Jinping, in which I had included almost everything that we knew. And I said, you know, the material just isn't there. Plus, as we all know, things were getting much tighter in China. It was much more difficult to get information. And then time passed, and several things happened. Xi Jinping made himself, in effect, ruler for life. He was not going to go away. There was this thing called COVID-19, which you may remember. The world changed, and suddenly, round about 2022, it became clear that this was a formidable figure on the world stage. And really, apart from some very distinguished and very estimable academic books, there wasn't a simple book about him. And so I began to look around, and I was lucky to work with an exceptional researcher, Howard Zhang, former head of the BBC's Chinese service, who's a fabulously well-informed and connected person. And it all came together. And it was a question of sorting the material, compressing the material, putting in things that people would be interested in, but not missing any key facts either. And the Hong Kong book was about 180,000 words. This book is about 82,000 words. This book was much harder to write.
I can see why. And I really want to get into some of the really great nuggets in this book and get into some of the details, and then we'll get to our main topic, which is how Xi Jinping and Donald Trump will talk to each other. But just one kind of broader question on this. You know, when I was there as the Washington Post bureau chief in 2011 and 2012, leading up to the 18th Party Congress, many of us were speculating, and I think I probably wrote at the time, that there's some optimism that Xi Jinping might be a reformer. He's younger, he's more confident as a princeling, as the son of someone. He might be the one to actually be confident enough to open up China a little bit. And were we all wrong?
Yes, including me. Look, when you write for the Sunday Times, you have to put a spin on each weekly story, because you're trying to do a story that's different from the day-to-day news. And Xi Jinping, frankly, was a pain, because he was another boring middle-aged guy in a suit. And so it was very difficult to persuade editors in London that you should take any notice of him at all. And if you picture in your mind's eye that moment when the new Politburo Standing Committee walks out in front of 1.35 billion people, and they are all middle-aged men in suits. So it was also pretty clear in Beijing at the time. You talk to diplomats, colleagues, Chinese people, Chinese journalists. In those days, you could still speak, quite frankly, to Chinese officials. There was a sense that this was the establishment candidate. He was a safe pair of hands. He didn't rock the boat. He had the backing of all the major power figures in the party. It was steady as she goes. Little did we know what would turn out.
Go back to that period of 2012, which I remember very well. It was a steady as she goes transition, but there was a lot of chaos leading up to that. We had Bo Xilai, who people thought might be a contender, and suddenly he was taken down in a power struggle. There were rumors of tanks on the streets in Beijing, which we never know if that was true. Was there really some coup attempt, et cetera? I mean, take us back to that period. How How easy was it for Xi to ascend, and was there some backroom turmoil going on?
Well, there's a mystery period, which is from the late summer of 2012 until he emerges to be crowned at the party congress. There's no question he vanished from public view. And for the book, I talked to, American, Western intelligence sources and people who follow these things, and the truth is they don't know. We don't really know why he simply went into purdah. What we do know, because we have now been able to reconstruct it, is that was not a smooth transition. It was very turbulent. It came close to violence. People were ruined. Bo Xilai, as you know, was purged and put on trial. A whole swathe of senior political figures vanished. People died. People fell off buildings. I think the biggest thing that struck me when I was doing this was, at first I thought, they compare Vladimir Putin and Russia and Xi Jinping and China, and I thought, no, it's not like that. We know Putin's a gangster and the Kremlin is a mafia enterprise and they're full of criminals and people murder each other. But China's not like that. It's a strong institutional state, it's a 1,000-year-old civilization, etc., etc. And actually, it is just like that. And the more you find out about 2012, even from accounts in the official media, it's sensational. The Chinese press itself has said that the former head of the entire security apparatus had his first wife murdered so he could marry a television presenter.
That was Zhu Yongkang, right?
Yeah. And the more you dug into this, and we as journalists get caught up day by day and week by week, you rush on to the next thing. And when you stop and look at what was actually reported officially in the Chinese media, let alone what was reported in the diaspora, it's quite extraordinary.
It's amazing, reading the book. I mean, I didn't know if I was reading an episode of Secession or The Sopranos. I mean, people are dying, people are getting, disappearing, et cetera, et cetera. Absolutely fascinating. Again, I'm going to talk about some of the little nuggets in the book, and I hope if you followed Chinese politics over the years, you will even know who we're talking about. But Bo Xilai was the party boss in Chongqing, which is kind of in southwestern China. He was a pretty powerful fellow. Like Xi Jinping, he was one of these fellow princelings. His father had been, I think, been long marching with Mao, etc. And so they were kind of considered rivals, but you say in the book they weren't really rivals. They were kind of contemporaries. But the story of Bo Xilai always was, and we've reported this, that he was arrested along with his wife for the murder of a British businessman. And the idea was that his wife, named Gu Kailai, and she was tried for this in China, had poisoned this British businessman, seduced him to Chongqing, poisoned him, and he was found dead in a hotel room in Chongqing. But you say that story that we all reported was wrong.
Well, of course, we in the British press absolutely adored that story because it had everything, sensational murders, affairs, public schoolboys gone wrong, all that kind of stuff. Look, I mean, Bo Xilai is the most interesting figure in contemporary China, apart from Xi Jinping. He was the only Chinese politician who resembled the kind of political operator you would meet in the West. Perhaps you met him. I met him several times when he was Minister of Commerce. He was very charismatic.
Good-looking guy, tall?
He was tall, he was imposing, he had a media presence.
Spoke English?
He spoke very good English. He got on very well with a certain Peter Mandelson, who was then the European Union trade negotiator and is now the UK's ambassador to the court of President Trump. So he was an extraordinary figure, and he was a bit too much, I think, for the staid Communist Party bureaucracy and the elite. And he made himself, he was a populist, he was one of the original populists who made himself into a well-known figure. The experts will tell you that, formally speaking, he posed no threat to Xi Jinping. And his own family have said since these events that he never intended to contest for the leadership. But he was seen as a rival. And he was brought down. That enabled Xi Jinping to come out on top and to establish his own domination over a group of families who now rule China. Very, very messy. Bo Xilai, two things to remember about him. He's older than Xi Jinping, and he's now been in prison for many years. He's supposed not to be in great health. But one incredible thing we discovered, photo analysis and data and stuff like that, Bo Xilai may be in prison, but his family are still in favor. And there is a photograph from 2021 showing his brother, Bo Xilai, on the stand at Tiananmen Square in the honored ranks next to the existing hierarchy. So you never quite know in China where these things are beginning and ending.
Even with Xi Jinping, you never know. He was on the outs for a long time, et cetera. The official narrative was that he went down and had to work during the Cultural Revolution in Shanxi with a work group. I think you said five young men, et cetera. He talks now about how that really steeled him. That made him kind of appreciate the peasantry, et cetera. But you found out in your book that he actually hated it and escaped and tried to get back to Beijing.
Look, Xi Jinping himself has written about this. One of the advantages of working with Howard was that we could go into the Chinese documents in much more detail and then trace internet commentaries and links. And we found, for example, there was a Hong Kong newspaper interview with Xi Jinping's younger brother, which has been scrubbed from the Chinese internet and you can't find it anymore, but we got a copy of it. And you get these nuggets. And this is why I think writing the book was much easier than I thought, because it was all there. It was just hiding in plain sight. And that enabled us to reconstruct in his own words and those of his family, his childhood, which was incredibly traumatic. You know, imagine that you're a little child again, you grow up in this privileged household, you go to a lovely school, everybody's singing red songs, and then age 9, your world turns upside down. Your father vanishes. You're banished to a horrible, creepy little courtyard house with your mother and siblings, and then the Cultural Revolution breaks out, paraded on a stage, beaten, imprisoned, humiliated, forced to stand age 13 in front of a baying crowd, shouting down with Xi Jinping, among them his own mother, right? This is one tough guy. He then goes to the countryside, survives some years, he does escape, runs back to Beijing, is sent back to the village, and comes out on top. I mean, this is, of course, the approved narrative. But this is one tough guy. So, you know, when you hear about Western politicians traipsing off to Beijing, and some of them like to think they have their own backstory and they came up the hard way and all the rest of it, the Chinese leadership look at these people and laugh.
You know, so many nuggets in this book. Just a couple more I wanted to just bring the audience's attention to. You mentioned, well, first of all, you were able to dig out some details that I never knew existed about Xi Jinping's first wife and how she disappeared to London and was hanging around the Cambridge professor.
I mean, this is just an extraordinary story, but it is all true. Xi Jinping's first wife was a very elegant, cultivated young woman called Ke Xiaoming. Her father was the Chinese ambassador to London in the 1970s. And they met at university in Beijing. Xi Jinping had got to university on a special, you would call it affirmative action program for people who had lost their education.
He was a DEI guy.
They met, they courted, it was a dynastic marriage. They were married for 3 to 4 years. She said, you can trace all this, some of this came out in the WikiLeaks cable some years ago, and the rest of it has come out. Basically, the marriage was a failure from the start. They lived in a leadership compound. She said they fought every day. They were completely different characters. And eventually, she left him and went back to live in London because her father was still the ambassador. I think this is the beginning of the 1980s. Chinese people could not do this. And they divorced. After that, it's 4 or 5 years before he meets his second wife. She lived her life in London quite openly, going to dinner parties and socializing with the Chinese community for decades. She was reasonably well known. Then Xi Jinping comes to power, and it all changes. She takes a lower profile. Everything around her movements is clouded in mystery. We think she had a British passport, but we can't be sure. She met well-known authors, people like Zhong Chang and Sheridan in London socially. I came across somebody who met her in Chengdu in 2012, where she was with a new partner, very artistic, cultivated, charming person, loved culture, loved art, and so on. The last thing we know is that at the end of 2018, her father, the former ambassador, died aged 103 in Beijing. And she went to Beijing and attended his funeral. There is a photograph of her in one of these Chinese memorial halls, lined up with other relatives, and there are wreaths from the Xi family and so on. That was January 2019, and what I can say for sure is that she has not been seen since.
Wow. It's really like a soap opera script there.
Yeah, I mean, the gossip, which is not substantiated in the Chinese exile community, is that he ordered her passport to be confiscated and she remains in China. I don't know. We were not able to pin that down any further. Sadly, there are not legions of intelligence officers willing to share their insights with the hacks.
The other little nugget that I got out of there that I had not seen reported, and maybe I'm just remiss here, is that Xi Jinping has a niece who's married to a Briton who's doing business in China.
Indeed, he was trying to set up an electric vehicle business.
How do you get married? How do you get married into the president's family in China?
There was a very good profile of him in the Atlantic magazine when they first came to public notice. He was just another expat, hanging around Beijing, drinking in the bars and trying his luck. He met, they fell in love, they married, and after an initial bit of publicity, they went very low profile, only surfaced again after COVID-19, where he was appointed as the China agent for an electric vehicle company, which has since gone bankrupt. So that's where that story ends.
Those are my nuggets. When you finished this, you got your research done, you're looking at the manuscript. Was there any one thing or two things that really made your eyes pop out and say, wow, I never knew I could get this?
I think it comes down to how little we know. I mean, here is a world leader, debatably the most powerful world leader, because he does not have term limits. He will be there if he's alive 4, 5, 10 years from now. And officially, we don't even know his date of birth. If you look at Chinese literature, the official profiles all say Xi Jinping, Han Chinese, son of so-and-so, born Beijing, June 1953. The only reason that we know it was June the 15th is that his mate Vladimir Putin sends him a birthday telegram every year. And the Russians then report that this was delivered, and the Chinese never report it. So this is a great insight. These people have lived by party discipline all their lives. We can't really imagine this because we live in undisciplined societies. But the contrasts that we'll come to between the present leaders of China and America are really kind of existential. That you have people like Xi Jinping, who's now 71, 72 years old. His entire life has been lived in a framework of discipline and secrecy and observance. And they're all like that. And that, to me, was the real revelation, that we've been kind of thinking, oh, well, they're a normal country and a normal government. They're not. They come from a different world.
That's what I find so amazing, is that you were able to pierce that veil of secrecy. When I was there as a correspondent in 2012, for example, I tried several times to just get a copy of Xi Jinping's master's degree thesis that he wrote while he was in charge of Fujian province. I was not only rebuffed, but at some point I was told, stop asking these questions or you're going to get yourself in trouble. You managed to figure it out.
No, I can't claim the credit for that. I, at the time, had the Sunday Times had a very good research helper in China who, regrettably, we have never been able to name or give them the appropriate credit. And this person was very well connected, and communicated with me one day that he had something to share. We met in Hong Kong, and he handed over a copy of Xi Jinping's doctoral thesis, annotated by dissident historians and other academics who had got a copy, commented on it, and essentially dissected it and said it was a piece of plagiarism, that you know, somebody else at the university had actually written it for him. You know, you can get indignant about that. We wrote a story in the Sunday Times about it, but I mean, there are plenty of Western politicians that get other people to polish their resumes and write their books and so on. So I can't get too upset about that. But it does show that in China, very basic things are state secrets. It remains the case that even obtaining publicly available information can get somebody into trouble. There are people in Xinjiang, for example, who are in jail for having sent in the mail copies of official newspapers to people in the United States. That is deemed to be communicating state secrets. So, you know.
Absolutely incredible. So I guess to broaden it out from the little nuggets now to what people here may be most interested in finding out, I mean, I want to ask you broadly, and then we'll burrow down into it a little bit more. The broadest question is, what makes Xi Jinping tick? What is it that he sees as his driving force? Now, you write a lot about his idea of trying to rejuvenate China to take its place on the global stage. You write about the hardship he suffered, which makes him abhor chaos. You know, he's got all of these various factions and experiences kind of pushing him in different directions. But what do you think is the real thing that people need to understand about him today and where he might take China?
Resilience. He is someone who has never given up. He endured this extraordinary childhood of imprisonment, exile, beatings, deprivation, whatever. He hung on. He got back to Beijing. He went to university, gets his first job in the defense ministry. It's an incredible job, one of 3 private secretaries to the man running the whole Chinese defense establishment. And he just gets his head down, you know. His rivals fell by the wayside. He was just a very diligent worker and a good administrator, and somebody who, there's a WikiLeaks cable there, the CIA estimate said, you know, he kept his eye on the prize, and he didn't give up. I remember meeting kind of elite Chinese bankers in Hong Kong, but just after he came to power, and all these sort of families, people working for big American investment banks and so on. I said, well, you know, Xi Jinping, not very clever really, and you know, he's not an intellectual. He doesn't read great books. He's got no theoretical background, and you know, not that smart. To which I said, well, he's not doing badly so far.
But again, is it all about accumulating power, or does he actually have an agenda? Does he know where he's taking China, or is it really all about just accumulating power onto himself and staying as long as he can?
Well, there's a lot of people in Langley, Virginia would pay handsomely for authentic information about that. But look, of course he has a vision for China. He has a very ambitious vision for China, along with his mate, Mr. Putin. You know, they see the world moving. Well, they are on the record. There's this extraordinary piece of video, which you can find on YouTube, of Xi Jinping exiting the Kremlin and saying farewell to Putin, and the two of them exchanging words knowingly within microphone capture. And Xi Jinping says, there are changes unseen in the world for 100 years, and we are the ones driving them. And Putin says, I agree. They shake hands, they go down. So they, you know, make no doubt about the ambition. In terms of power, there's a great quote in the book from a person from one of these very elite families who lectured me and said, you know, long list of things you don't understand about China, which I freely confess. And he said, look, all this stuff about the tycoons, the money, we just saw the last few days Xi Jinping greeting the titans of Chinese tech industry and so on. He said, look, in China, money is not power. Power is power. It's always been like that. And these people at the top, in the Politburo, on the Standing Committee, they have things that money cannot buy. And I thought that was very insightful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That incredibly insightful. Let me, one of the things that Xi Jinping is most associated with is the anti-corruption drive. And from your book, I saw that when he went to Fujian, even he was kind of shocked at the level of corruption. This is a province in China that faces Taiwan. It's close to a lot of mafia there, trading going on. And he kind of, tackled it in a way. But now that he's in the top job, he's been going after corruption. But you also indicate that he's actually using corruption as a way to purge his potential enemies. So which is it? Is he really concerned about cleaning up the corruption in the party, or is he only trying to rid the party of his enemies?
Well, it's well authenticated, both in open source intelligence assessments and his own speeches, that he, since his youth, has been appalled by the depth of corruption in China. He sees it as a weakness, but equally, he operates within a system that institutionalizes it. And so there is this thing called the Central Committee for Discipline and Inspection, which is supposedly a fearless prosecutorial apparatus that goes after people equally and so on and so forth. It has brought down both tigers and flies, as the Chinese saying has it, but it's clearly been targeted against political enemies. Nonetheless, by some estimates, 1 million officials have been purged since he came to power. And you can go to the official media for death sentences, prison sentences, tycoons vanishing, executives going to prison, companies collapsing. I mean, that is very serious stuff. But one thing that you then understand when you go into it a bit more is that this Central Commission, it's a chessboard, it's not a hammer. And all the top families have got their people on the chessboard. So who chooses what investigation to pursue and how you use the law against your political opponents, well, these are questions in your own fine country even today. It's not as simple as that. Yes, he sees corruption as institutionally weakening China. I mean, look at the army. The army was completely rotten from top to bottom. It was indolent, it was greedy, it was ancient, it didn't adopt technology. Everybody had their hand out. And he has sharpened that up big time. So, it's selective, but it's also effective.
But you also write in the book that he's not necessarily cleaner than Caesar's wife himself, or at least his family. And you talk about kind of Xi Inc. with his sister, two sisters, and they have business interests, and they use this guy Xiao Jinhua to go down to Hong Kong to try to make that anonymous. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, look, all credit in the finances of the Xi Jinping family still belongs to the New York Times and to Bloomberg for the investigations they did in 2012, led by Mike Forsyth, our colleague. That has never been matched. Equally, it's never been challenged. So the estimated worth of his sister and her husband was approximately $370 million in 2012. After the publicity, that investment or those assets were reshuffled and they were anonymized. So I've never heard that Xi Jinping himself is personally corrupt or self-enriching. It's not like, again, it's not quite like Putin. I mean, we all know about Putin's palaces and jets and all the rest of it. But again, that's not how it works in China because money is not power. What did happen, which really shows you just how mafia-like this is the family used this financier called Xiao Jinhua to reshuffle their assets and park them in anonymized places. He was foolish enough to talk about it. He actually gave some media comments on the record thinking stupidly that he would gain credit by saying, well, the family made this sacrifice for the country and so on. I mean, you don't do that with these people. And in due course, he was kidnapped, essentially, from the Four Seasons Hotel in Hong Kong, spirited across the border. He then vanishes for 5 years before he is put on a corruption trial in 2022 and bundled off to jail for the foreseeable future. So, like, you do not mess with these people.
Amazing stuff. We're going to get to questions in about 4 or 5 minutes. So if you've got a question, start thinking of it now and formulating it. And maybe you can start moving towards the mic. Since we've got now one experience of Xi Jinping working with President Trump for the first term, what do you think he has discerned about dealing with the Trump administration? And what do you think we can expect in Trump 2.0?
Well, I think we should forget the idea that there's any kind of personal chemistry. I talked to one person who was there at Mar-a-Lago when Xi Jinping and his wife arrived for a Trump hospitality special. And it was interesting, apparently, because Trump is very shrewd. He's a businessman, he's a negotiator, and he's adept at using his personality and his charm to engage with people. And evidently, over the course of drinks and dinner, and a lot of attempts at small talk and engagement, it got nowhere. And this is the same experience that other world leaders have gone through with Xi Jinping. He's a trained, disciplined Chinese communist who absorbed the lessons of Stalin. He doesn't do small talk. And there was I imagine Trump had been briefed by the CIA or whatever to ask about things that, they didn't know about. So, for example, his daughter.
Who went to Harvard.
Who went to Harvard, then returned to China, then evidently went back to Harvard. And quite a lot known about her. I didn't, to be honest, I didn't put all of it in the book because I don't think, frankly, it's fair to her. She's not responsible for what her father does. But there was this wonderful moment where Trump says to Xi Jinping, oh, what about your lovely daughter? We'd so like to see more of her, and so on and so forth. And Xi Jinping looked at him and just said, oh, yes, but we missed her so much, she just had to come back to China. End of story.
So when Joe Biden says that he got this great relationship, he knows Xi better than anyone else. He's an old Irish backslapping Paul.
Well, he tried that, but actually they met, I think, 8 times between 2011 and 2023. And the key Biden quote on the record is, "We're not friends, it was just business." And they made a lot of efforts to engage. As vice presidents, they were able to spend time together in a more relaxed format. And, we have accounts of that, both from Biden, from Evan Medeiros, who was his consigliere at the time. Again, very formulaic. Biden trying the outreach. Very creditable. Look, the Americans, I think, have done a fantastic job in managing the relationship with this leader and with the China that he has created. They have spared no effort, right? I mean, Biden saw the guy time after time after time. They went around China, they engaged, they talked. Very high-grade translation, no risk of ambiguity, etc. They really did engage. And Joe Biden came back to Washington convinced that this was a much more serious, much more determined, and formidable opponent, much stronger an opponent than the United States had faced for 30 or 40 years. Now, what do they make of the chemistry between him and Trump? When they meet together, it's very scripted, it's very formulaic. What I think will be fascinating is let's see the first high-level visits. Let's see the first exchanges. Because what happened between the Biden administration and Xi Jinping was really rough. It was very, very tough. And I think both in Beijing and in Washington, everybody is waiting to see what will be the first move.
From what you've learned about Xi Jinping writing this book, how do you think he's going to deal with China's economy slowing down? Demography is against them. They've got a lot of challenges. How do you think he's going to handle this?
I think they're very confident about it. You saw only 2 days ago the summit, so-called, between Xi Jinping and the leading figures in Chinese tech industry and so on. He's talked about what he calls new productive forces. They're very aware of the economy, but they have a model. It's a hybrid, they talk about it, socialism with Chinese characteristics. The state is essentially in control. The party is now much more deeply rooted in companies than it was 10 or 20 years ago. They acknowledge the private sector, but there is no doubt who is in charge. And that's the message that came across with this rather ludicrous video footage from a couple of days ago. These guys worth untold billions sitting there like schoolboys while Xi Jinping comes in a kind of casual jacket. Interesting. The man behind him was the Prime Minister, and the man behind him was a man called Wang Huning, who is the ideologue, who has been on the scene from the beginning. This guy is an unreconstructed authoritarian statist, and he is the ideology person behind Xi Jinping.
He's the academic, right?
He's the Shanghai academic turned kind of political counselor, been at the side of 3 Chinese leaders.
He gave us Xi Jinping thought.
He did.
He gave us the scientific development
Of
Hu
Hu Jintao.
Jintao, and he gave us the 3 represents under Jiang
Zemin. Yeah, well,
That's
I
a
have to think of
terrible
something
name.
for poor old
The
Jiang
3
Zemin.
represents. It sounds better in Chinese.
Yeah. This guy is bad news. Bizarrely, I found myself about 100 yards away from him in 1989 because he was a professor at Fudan University. And I was working for The Independent. We went to cover the aftermath of Tiananmen. I was in Shanghai with our former colleague Richard Bernstein from the New York Times, great China hand, and got out to the university, which was barricaded, rubber tires burning, police running back. And Wang Huning was the most unpopular professor on the campus.
Really?
He was an unreconstructed neo-authoritarian, and you had thousands of young Chinese students demonstrating for democracy and quoting Byron and Shelley. And Wang Huning was plucked from that academic background and made into a political counselor. He is a very tough cookie.
Interesting. And in one more.
Sorry, by the way, he's thought to be very much the guiding hand behind China's Taiwan policy.
I was just about to ask about Taiwan because you had this kind of picture of, in the book of Xi Jinping when he was in Fujian and he always was in the coastal provinces and looking out over Taiwan. What do you think his intentions are regarding Taiwan?
Well, again, in Langley, Virginia, they would be very keen to know. Okay, he has said that the armed forces of China must be ready to take Taiwan in 2027. He has then been systematically misquoted because telling the military that they have to be in a state of readiness is not the same thing as telling them to execute an operation. I was in Taiwan for the election there a year ago, almost exactly, and it was, as usual in Taiwan, it was wonderful and reassuringly weird that this normality went on, supposedly under the threat of war. And in fact, the outcome of the election, as I'm sure many know, is that it was that the Democratic, the pro-independence party, if you like, gained the presidency but lost its majority in parliament, so the political gridlock. And actually that wasn't a bad outcome as far as China was concerned. They don't need to take Taiwan. People in Taiwan, many of our colleagues as journalists and people who are politically active, what they fear is a slow death by 1,000 cuts. And, you have the whole manifesto of Putin-type actions in Crimea, you have internal dissent, you have espionage, you have disinformation, you have commercial pressure. I think it's, I don't personally think, I've done 3 or 4 Taiwan elections, and I don't think Xi Jinping is going to storm the beaches of Taiwan. Restaging Saving Private Wong on the beaches, they don't have to. Like all militaries, and again, the Americans have done really excellent professional analysis of this, which is all there to read. They have developed a suite of options for the party, just as any military would, and those go all the way from a full-scale invasion to endless salami slicing, you know, blockades, quarantines, inspections of ships at sea, interdictions of air lanes. There's a whole suite of things they can do to raise the pressure and lower it. And the Biden administration, for all the criticism it has received, was exceptionally successful in basically stopping World War III. And they deterred the Chinese from taking rash moves at a time when we now know there were people in Beijing, having watched Putin and Ukraine, and indeed then watched Hamas in the Middle East, thinking that this was the moment to strike. And I think that when Blinken and Sullivan write their memoirs, we will learn a lot more about just how close the world came to something really very dangerous indeed.
And you read in the book that in 2019, Xi Jinping was actually ready to send troops across the border into Hong Kong to put down the protests, but they decided not to at the last minute.
Yes, well, we knew that at the time, and at the end of 2019, I was doing the last interviews for my book on Hong Kong in Hong Kong. It'd been a very tumultuous year. There were photographs of the People's Armed Police exercising in the stadium in Shenzhen. And I picked up at the time from people I interviewed, I mean, some very prominent people in Hong Kong who, alas, it would be unhelpful to name, but, you know, really serious people. The billionaires essentially appealed to Xi Jinping for patience. He was that close. The rioting, because well, let's face it, it was rioting, it was violent disorder, it was assaults on the police, it was burning vehicles, whatever, that went on in the autumn of 2019 was intolerable to the Communist Party over the long term. And as they have done before, they put in place the military resources to intervene and take over if necessary. And let's face it, Hong Kong is a Chinese city, it's sovereign territory. What would we have done? Nothing.
Yeah. Okay, we want to take some questions. So as you're coming to the mic, as people are coming to the mic, I just want to ask you one thing. Could you talk a little bit about what you discovered about WHO during COVID and their dealings with China? It's so fascinating. And then please come up, we'll go straight to a question after this. But it's such a fascinating topic. You discovered some things that were not reported.
Well, look, let me just make clear that the book is about the political relationship between China and the WHO and the outside world. It is scrupulously neutral on all COVID controversies. I don't take a position on lockdowns or masks or vaccinations or whatever. It's not the book's remit. So the narrow focus on what did China do, what did WHO know, and what did they do, I actually found very shocking. I was living in Geneva at the time. I knew quite a few people at WHO. I have to say the only time I was actually scared was when I found out in January 2023 that the top of the WHO in Geneva had frankly been hopelessly compromised by China. And they had two missions to China. One was in February, March 2020 to ascertain the Chinese policy response. And the second, much more controversially, was a mission to establish the origins in 2021. Both those missions were essentially controlled by the Chinese. And that is what has now led Trump and co. to withdraw the US from the WHO. It's extremely serious, hasn't been addressed. A lot more is going to come out.
Fascinating chapter in the book. I think we should open it for questions.
Yeah, this is the quietest audience I think I can ever recall in the FCCT clubhouse. You're kind of stunned. Now, the normal procedure is that you come forward and ask questions, identify yourself. And I cannot believe in a room full of journalists there's nobody there. So go to the microphone. So whilst he's running to the microphone, I'll ask a quick question. Do you think, you were talking about this idea that they can hold off indefinitely on invading Taiwan. Do you think that the volatility that Trump is creating and all this debate about annexing, what have you, is likely to trigger any kind of reaction in Peking, in Beijing? Would it make it more likely over the next 4 years that something will happen there?
I think one lesson we can draw from the life of Xi Jinping and the life of the Communist Party is that they do not do things quickly or rashly. They have a plan, they have a policy, and they stick to it, which is one of the reasons why it's so boring listening to their rhetoric time after time after time. But, you know, somebody like Trump and certain other world leaders will improvise. They will make policy, you know, on the fly. But when a Chinese leader goes into an international negotiation, he does so with a very carefully defined set of parameters which have been hammered out in policy discourse at all levels. They don't do spontaneous diplomacy. They don't act rashly. There's no record of them doing anything so improvised that it was calamitous. The bad things they have done have been well planned. Proliferating the nuclear warheads to Pakistan, for example. Bad thing to do, done very deliberately, but they didn't do it overnight.
Okay, so Sebastian.
Good evening. Thank you very much for a really, really fascinating talk, and I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. My name is Sebastian Berger. I'm the Southeast Asia Bureau Chief for the International News Agency AFP. I was based in Beijing from 2012 to 2017, and I'm a former president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, which is not an authorized organization in the People's Republic. I want to take you back to the what you talked about in the autumn of 2012 and Xi's ascension to power, and the fact that not just the media, but also the global analyst community, certainly in public, largely got him very, very wrong and portrayed him not just as a potential reformer, but as a consensus builder, someone who could navigate between factions and so on, would not be, would be a centrist, if you like. Why did you think that happened? And do you think that the party itself, those factions, do you think they knew what was coming? How did they get it so wrong themselves?
Well, the way I put it in the book is that they groomed a manager and ended up with a dictator. But actually, I'm reasonably optimistic. Just because everybody has subdued their opinions to spout Xi Jinping thought and say what a wonderful inspiration he is and so on, doesn't mean that politics is dead in China. The families and the factions and the groupings and the opinions are still there. And I spoke to a former, very well-informed official in the last Trump administration who says, and I use it towards the end of the book, that he believes that Xi Jinping will not fall from power, that he will die of natural causes in office like Stalin. So there must be a chance of that in the next 5 or 10 years. He hasn't had the healthiest of lifestyles. And I actually think that, what do we know? We know the Financial Times just did a long article coming to this conclusion. There is no successor. There is no succession plan. There's no obvious rival. So when he dies, an optimistic scenario is that China goes back to a more collective kind of leadership. So there's no one Napoleonic dictatorial figure. They tried that before. And, you know, a lot of people in China think it's not working out that great so far. So I am actually quite optimistic in the long term about both the politics and economy of China. I think that, you know, you travel in the country for 20 years, it's an incredible place, amazing culture, civilization, genius. They deserve better than an emperor. And that's what I say, that hope is that as well as being the Red Emperor, he will be the last one.
Matthew Rafat, Lananat Agency. My takeaway from the last hour is that China does not suffer from a cult of personality. At the same time, the United States is becoming more and more like the Soviet Union. My question is, what impediments do you see to a closer Russian-Chinese relationship, both economically and socially? And what impediments do you see to China's continued build-out of the new Silk Road?
Gosh, how long have we got? So Russian-Chinese friendship. was pretty artificial. You know, it's a friendship of porcupines. What do we know from the life of Xi Jinping? Again, his first job after university was working for a man called Geng Biao, who was then the chief of the Chinese defense establishment. We know that Geng Biao went to Washington, and we found declassified American documents recounting how he told the Americans the inside story of the Sino-Soviet split, and he made clear that Russia was the historic enemy. And Xi Jinping was one of 3 private secretaries in his office as an impressionable young man. On the walls of that office hung the maps of 19th century China, showing the vast tracts of land that were taken by the Tsars from the Qing dynasty. And those pieces of land are today Vladimir Putin's Pacific Eastern oblasts, and he is not giving them back. So Russia actually took far more territory from China than any colonial European power. They just don't like to mention it very much. And these are historical, strategic, racial and cultural divides that will not go away just because Xi Jinping and Putin are making common cause at the moment. The Silk Road, there's a lot of talk in Washington, as Keith knows, about trying to undermine the Chinese and sabotaging what they do and competing with them in nations along the maritime Silk Road and Central Asia and so on. I mean, we've seen this in Africa, but the answer surely is we need to outcompete the Chinese government. The Western liberal democratic capitalist model has actually got quite a lot going for it, for all its imperfections. And any of us who like been to Kenya, for example, have seen the contradictions that emerge eventually from big Chinese aid projects that essentially funnel money back to China. So the Western model is more appealing, but we just need to be better at promoting it, basically.
Sean Crispin, Asia Times. I haven't read it yet, Michael, but congratulations. What an important contribution at a very crucial time. I'm wondering, just through your research over the years, if there's any sense in Beijing, in the power circles, that Xi Jinping blew it, that everything was going so well. We enter the WTO, we open our economy to trade, to foreign investment, we boom, we're a miracle, we're lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. Xi Jinping comes along and takes much of that surplus that could have gone to the other 600 million people that are still in abject poverty and put it into what was seen, at least from Washington's perspective, into a rapid militarization, right? A rapid military buildup that challenged America's military primacy. With that, obviously, we've seen the repercussions, right? We have the trade war, we have the chip war, we have Trump, we have everything, right? And now China's economy is starting to suffer accordingly. Do you think there's anything inside China that's like, gosh, this guy's not necessarily in our best interest going forward? Is there anything left, is there any possible faction inside the party that has this sentiment and could act on it in the years ahead?
Of course there is. There's a lot of dissent in China. It's just not publicly expressed. And you only have to pick up the vibes from corporate engagement with the rest of the world, look at the Chinese investment flows, see what private enterprise and private capital is doing. People are voting with their bank transfers. Yeah, absolutely valid point. You could even argue that China grew to prosperity peacefully from the late 1970s until after WTO, thanks to the Pax Americana in the Pacific, which guaranteed freedom of commerce, kept the sea lanes open, protected international trade, helped open up China. It was a win-win situation in many ways for many people for a long time. Has Xi Jinping blown it? Well, this is a determined political choice. It's not a blunder, right? It's not a mistake. He admires Stalin. He grew up studying Mao. He is, if anything, less liberal economically than his father was. So don't make the mistake of thinking this is some sort of blunder or a mistake. There's a determined state policy which is going in a very well organized, coherent, and well articulated way. Every week you can read this stuff in the Chinese media. There's a journal called Chusha, which is the theoretical journal. It's all there. This is not a mistake, it's deliberate.
Your book's entitled Xi the Emperor, I believe, right? So is this an institutional decision? Let's militarize and challenge American primacy, or how much of this is actually Xi Jinping? Like, this is where the country needs to go.
Well, we'll only know the answer to that, I think, when future generations of Chinese historians hopefully gain access to archives and can talk to people. But Xi Jinping is a creature of the army. His father was a militant revolutionary who commanded military forces in the field, and he engaged in combat, and he saw terrible things during the Civil War. And not only did Xi Jinping grow up in an atmosphere socially and culturally impregnated with the army and the party, remember that to him and to the generation of red families around him, it was the People's Liberation Army which restored order after the Cultural Revolution, that brought law and order back to China, saved them, may well have saved their lives. And so the bond between the army and the leadership and these particular families is extremely strong. So it's no surprise that when he came to power, the constituency you look for is the army. I mean, Deng Xiaoping, who was the second most powerful leader after Mao, was never head of the Communist Party, and he was never the president of China. But what he did keep was his seat at the top of the Central Military Commission. That's what mattered. And Xi Jinping has absorbed that lesson very thoroughly. He is, even back in Fujian, what's he doing? He's taking care of the army garrisons. He's making sure that soldiers get pensions, people are looked after, bases are improved. This is a carefully nurtured constituency and an alliance that has grown up over decades, which is why people like Xi and his supporters look at our countries where governments change and chiefs of staff change every 4 or 8 years and think we're weak.
Peter Trainer, club member. Just wanted to ask, does Xi Jinping have any personal feelings about religious minorities or ethnic minorities? In Tibet, the Buddhist. In Xinjiang, it's Muslim. The Communist Party want to select Catholic leaders, Catholic bishops for the Catholic Church. There's a lot of religious and cultural suppression. Pardon me. Is any of this personal to Xi Jinping, or is it just the Communist Party's dogma that the minority, religious or cultural, should be suppressed? Does he have any personal interest in that?
One of the fascinating things we do know about his youth is that when he was a student, he mingled with a lot of other young people back from the countryside, and they were all allowed to go to university for the first time in years. And the Americans collected a lot of information from an informant who they nicknamed the Professor. His name was Xiao Jianhong, I think. He reported conversations with Xi Jinping. So in the late 1970s, a young man, as a student, deep fascination with Tibetan Buddhism, with esoteric practices, with Taoism, with the kind of mind and body discipline that was later adopted into cultish behaviors like Falun Gong and so on. He had a great deal of personal interest in religion. Remember, his father was in charge at one point of policy towards Tibet and solved a rebellion in Tibet with a mixture of cajolery, persuasion, bribery, and so on. He was not for the mailed fist. And his father also moderated policies in Xinjiang and stopped the radicals from destroying Muslim society, and showed in general, by communist standards, an enlightened interest in religions. We don't know of any personal belief or philosophy that Xi himself has vouchsafed. In terms of religion and control, it's a matter of party discipline and political organization. So they talk about this. There's a lot of literature. Sinicization of religion, which means that religions from whatever origin must in China conform to and coordinate with the government. And that applies agnostically across denominations. It's about political control. It's not about any spiritual investment whatsoever.
Question.
Yes, hi. Philip Sherwell from the Sunday Times, a kind of successor to Michael in that role. You talked about Taiwan, and you talked about how Xi and the Chinese institutionally, the PRC, don't take spontaneous, crazy, rush decisions. But also Xi has repeatedly talked about the national rejuvenation message, the Make China Great Again before Trump was making America Great Again message, and repeatedly sort of mentioned Taiwan as being absolutely central to that issue. And there is this sort of aberration for him just off the mainland in Fujian, which is a flourishing, successful, thriving democracy, which kind of proves that all his propaganda about those issues not being appropriate for Chinese people is nonsense. He now has, 4 years of the chaos and unpredictability of Trump. He's president for life, but maybe, 5 years, another few more years after that. If he's got one remaining goal, is it maybe Taiwan? And allowing for the fact that, you never know which way Trump is going to go. Is this his opportunity? Could the next few years be the chance to think it through, but make that move?
Well, if you analyze what is actually written and published in the Chinese media, they have a very cleverly calibrated approach to this. Without question, he has made it clear in speech after lecture, after article, after discourse that the complete unification of China is a prime national objective. If he can achieve that in his lifetime, he has made it clear, but not explicitly so, that that would be the crowning seal on his rulership of China. So it's a neat formula to say, well, he tells the army to get ready by 2027, they have a plan, they take control, unification of China complete, place in history secured. Very simple in one way, but actually they've given themselves a lot of space. It's not like, certain other leaders who make dramatic announcements one day and then have to roll them back the next. They've given themselves space to move. And so, yes, he would love to be the person that puts an end to the Chinese Civil War and unifies the country. But I'll finish with a quote from somebody who studied him very closely and had access to all the US government's intelligence assessments. And he said that Xi Jinping is a risk taker, but he is not reckless. And I think that's the thing you have to bear in mind.
We know that he wants Taiwan back. What, in your estimations, are his plans for Southeast Asia? Because we see all kinds of evidence of backdoor colonization, the crimes along the border with Burma, the fact that ASEAN has got a built-in split now because Cambodia's been hijacked, Laos is in the back pocket, we have a naval base in Ream on the coast of Cambodia. So you talk about an emperor, and I'm talking about possible expansion and encroachment. And then, of course, we've got the South China Sea, where this is absolutely glaringly apparent. Is this coming from him, or is this the CPP at work?
The military strategy that has evolved has done so over decades. And again, the United States has invested a great deal of high-grade professional and academic expertise to look at it. Under the previous dynasties of China, the nations or the states around it were tributary states. They acknowledged the sway of the Son of Heaven, they paid tribute, they deferred to China. It was a large inert power. It wasn't a dynamic power that went out and conquered things. And without question, they want to expel the United States from Asia. They talk about the island chains on purely military level, but there's a bigger cultural, economic, and social ambition, which is that the United States should be displaced from its role in this part of the Pacific. Do they have a means to achieve it? Let's get real. Yes, okay, there's a base in Cambodia, but I mean, for example, Thailand is about to stage Cobra Gold maneuvers with the United States and its other allies. There's a very long-standing, deeply rooted network of United States bases, interests, alliances, and so on. So there's a big mountain to climb if they actually want to do something. The worst thing I think that you could do, and let's hope precedent is not being set in Ukraine, is to make them think that we're weak. If they think that you're weak, they will come and get you.
Right, well, there's a race to the microphone, so whilst it's going on, I'll ask Keith to...
Sure. Just before we go, so the topic of this was actually Xi and Trump.
Well, yes.
So, yeah. So just as a last question before we go, and please everybody get the book. If it's a really rip-roaring read. But any last comments on how you think the Xi-Trump relationship will go?
Well, I'd like to know more about this purported phone call, and it just shows you the kind of worrying mismatch between Beijing and Washington that at various intervals your colleagues in the United States have not been able to ascertain, did this phone call take place? If so, when did it happen and who called who? Which is not a very promising start. Look, I mean, the Chinese are watching Washington just as acutely as we all are. And the United States has had bipartisan policy towards China in the last 5 years or so, a very exceptional team on the national security front, and indeed the State Department front. I mean, Nick Burns was clearly a very effective ambassador in Beijing. And so the Chinese state likes predictability. They're not going to get that. What they will have is a backup plan. They will have a sequenced set of responses to whatever the Trump administration does. We've just seen that with tariffs. So it's a waiting game. It's going to be very, very fascinating. But one thing I think we should disabuse ourselves of is the idea that there is some sort of magical chemistry that these two men in their 70s wearing suits are going to work everything out. I don't think it's going to happen like that.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thanks to the audience here. A terrific audience, terrific crowd here, and a terrific book. So I think it's available in the back, everybody.
It is.
Thank you.
So if you buy your copies of the book, they will be signed here.
Oh, sign here.
Okay, yeah, okay. Right.
Get the book and bring it up. He'll sign it.
Bring the money.